Welcome back everybody, my name is Nathan, you are watching the Salty Productions YouTube channel. Today we're taking a look at a pretty high power human tribal build led by Eowyn Shieldmaiden. Eowyn Shieldmaiden was actually the face commander for the human tribal precon that was released back in Lord of the Rings in 2023, but this deck has no relation to the precon and it is a bottoms up build in order to make Eowyn as high power as we possibly can, obviously without approaching CEDH territory. Before we get into the video, just want to go over a couple of quick channel announcements. First, I have a new Discord that is launching shortly. I just need to get certain permissions and things set up, but I'm super excited to invite you guys to my Discord so we can chat about Magic, talk about it in some voice channels, and just have a grand old time there. Additionally, I am launching a new Patreon soon, so stay on the lookout for that. I will have an announcement once that comes out as well. And then I have a new sponsorship that is in the works. You will hear more about them in future videos. And of course, I do make goldfish gameplay videos along with these deck techs, so if you want to see how this deck performs in a playtesting environment, the video will be linked down in the description below. You can check out how this deck goldfishes. It aims to finish the game by about turn 8 or turn 9 with a lethal board state by about turn 7, which I have found can accomplish quite reliably. And of course, the typical YouTube stuff, like and subscribe and all of that fun stuff. All right, jumping in to Eowyn Shieldmaiden. Eowyn Shieldmaiden is a 5/4 human knight for 5 mana in the Jeskai color identity. She has first strike. At the beginning of combat on your turn, if another human ETB under your control this turn, create 2/2/2 red human knight creature tokens with trample and haste. Then if you control 6 or more humans, draw a card. Now, how human tribal decks typically perform is by going wide with a token strategy, and this one is no different. However, the way we go about making tokens is a little bit different than your typical human tribal deck. I have played around and tinkered with this deck a lot, and I have found that it is actually not optimal to play the quote-unquote human staples such as Horn of Gondor, Adeline Resplendent Cathar, and other token creators that are very efficient like that, because we actually want to be copying Eowyn a lot. There's a lot going on with this commander, and so the way that we squeeze the most value out of Eowyn is actually just copying her. And once we start copying her, we will be demanding a board wipe very soon, and we have a lot of removal to defend against those board wipes that will be pointed in our direction. The other thing I wanted to discuss, actually, before we get into the individual card discussions, is some macro stats. I'd like to take you guys through these to show what our curve actually looks like. So once we head into Moxfield, the average CMC of this deck is actually 3.19, so very affordable from a mana perspective. And the lands are quite optimized to generate color pips. We have 30 white sources, 28 blue sources, 25 red sources, only 9 tapped lands, because we want to be making sure we're dropping untapped lands in order to play Eowyn by turn 4. And then we have a few lands that generate some life loss in order to generate all those nice pips, and a few utility lands. And I will also go through the tutor guide here that you can see down in the bottom of the description. I just want to talk a little bit about the price. This deck does come at quite a hefty cost. This is projected at about $1,000 on Moxfield, but don't let this scare you away, because I will be including a section at the end of the video where if you actually eliminate 20 of the most expensive cards, such as Greymund, Avastin Stalwart, Cavern of Souls, Mana Drain, etc., we can actually cut this deck down to about $400. So if you are against using proxies, personally, I use proxies in a lot of the decks I build, then you can certainly take a look at that section of the video if you wanted to actually purchase this deck and not lose an arm and a leg for it. Okay, so let's get into the general strategy that Eowyn aims to employ. So you'll notice here, if we look at our ramp category, we have 17 ramp pieces. That is a lot. That is a lot even for a green and blue ramp deck, and there is a intentional purpose to this, because we want to be getting Eowyn out as soon as physically possible. She is the crux of the deck strategy, and our removal and interaction is actually built around protecting Eowyn once she hits the field. So Eowyn is very much the core to our strategy, and because with Commander's power creep, a 5-mana commander is just relatively expensive to play nowadays, and so we really want to make sure that we can get her out early and start copying her. So the general game plan, phase 1, we're going to ramp. We have 17 ramp pieces to accomplish that, which means we're going to see between 1 and 2 of those pieces within our opening hand. Then we are going to cast Eowyn. we probably won't reap the benefits of getting the trigger on our first turn because typically Eowyn will come down on her own. And I have tinkered with certain cards that will allow you to get that first trigger from playing Eowyn, but I found that it is just not optimal to do that because you're playing a less valuable card overall than something that is just going to provide us more value. So if we take a look actually at a little card called Sheriff of Safe Passage, this is an example of what I mean. Sheriff, you can actually plot for only 2 mana, and then you can play it for 0 on a later turn. So I was at one point running this where I would play Eowyn, and then you would cast the Sheriff for free. You get that first trigger, make 2 tokens, draw a card, but generally the card quality is not that great. I would look at some other options like Thraben Doomsayer is another one that can do this, and even Cemetery Protector, but what I found is that it is better to hold up interaction to defend Eowyn than to run these suboptimal cards in order to get that first trigger, because we don't want just one Eowyn trigger, we want 50 of them. So how do we get 50 Eowyn triggers? Well, we are running 8 clone effects here. So things like Irenicus's Vile Duplication will allow us to create a token that's non-legendary. And a special shout out here, which we'll go over in just a second, Nanogene Conversion makes all creatures we control into Eowyn, and they're not legendary. So imagine this, you have 10 creatures on board, 9 tokens and an Eowyn, and all of a sudden all of those creatures become Eowyn. You move to combat, you generate 20 tokens, you draw 10 cards. It's absolutely insane. Nanogene Conversion is absolutely just a stellar win con in the deck. All right, and then phase 3, once we start copying Eowyn and getting all of these triggers, we're going to be drawing a ton of cards while we're at it because there's so much packed into that one trigger. We will start overrunning the board, so things like the new Banner of Kinship from Bloomburrow gives all of our creatures +1/+1 for each creature that we control of that type. Similar effect here with Porcelain Gallery, which I will maybe put in an edit where it's right side up so you can read the actual Porcelain Gallery portion of this card. So that's the general game plan. It's very similar to a go wide token strategy, but it is just a little bit more dependent on Eowyn, and we are not generating 1/1s. We are trying to draw a lot of cards while we're at it with Eowyn's trigger, drawing a card if we control 6 or more humans, which is relatively trivial to do. Okay, so let's jump into our early game plan here. So we have 17 ramp options. Ambitious Farmhand is always valuable to see because it will get a basic plains into our hand, and we always want to be drawing more lands, and it's also a human while we're at it, so it gets buffed on the field and is able to draw some basic plains, which is perfectly acceptable. Charitable Levy is going to slow down our opponents just a little bit, and I don't think that this card raises too many alarms because it says whenever a player casts a non-creature spell, put a collection counter on it. Then if there are 3 or more collection counters on it, sack it. If you do, draw a card. Then you may search your library for a plains card, put it onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle. So this is able to color fix us because it does not stipulate basic, and it actually is good that it goes away. Otherwise, this card will tend to get you killed just because people really don't like when their spells cost more. So you can basically use that from a political angle at the table to say, look, you just need to play into this a few times and then it will go away, no problem. All I want to do is basically do a rampant growth and draw a card for only 2 mana, which is absolutely stellar. And in Commander, it's relatively easy to trigger the non-creature clause on this before turn 4 when we drop Eowyn. Then we're running Cursed Mirror. Now, Cursed Mirror is a bit of an admittedly suboptimal choice, I will say. This one is still a little bit in experimentation phase, but the reason why I'm running it in this particular build is because, now obviously it's a mana rock in the early game, but in the late game, when we have non-legendary copies of Eowyn on the table, we can actually, for 3 mana, consider this almost as a pseudo-clone effect for only 1 turn to get another Eowyn trigger to have a copy, a non-legendary Eowyn creature token, and then once again we are just going to be stacking up this at the beginning of combat trigger as many times as we can. So I really like the fact that Cursed Mirror is good in both the early and late game. You always are happy to see this card, and even if you have just been board wiped and maybe your opponents have rebuilt faster than you can copy your opponent's Galta or something like that. Deranged Assistant, just going to be a great 2-mana Mana Dork that's also a human, so nice human synergy. That just helps us to overrun once we're ready to buff our creatures up. Dreamscape Artist is another suboptimal creature, I will say. The way that Dreamscape Artist works is it is basically a rampant growth on a creature that costs 2, so we're a little bit mana inefficient here, but what you can do is with its ability, although it costs 3 and you have to tap the green Dreamscape Artist, you can sacrifice the land that helped to pay for the activation, and then you can pitch a card, maybe a card that you're not quite ready to play, like an Overrun effect or something that's more towards the late game. And then you can search up 2 basics, put them on the battlefield, then shuffle, and they enter untapped. So while it does technically cost 3 and you have to tap the creature, what you really end up with is it costs 2 because you are sacrificing the land that was tapped for the ability, and then you get the land refunded, and then you get another land that is ready to be used as well. So you can actually parlay the activation trigger into future plays, future ramp plays. For example, if you have like another Charitable Levy in your hand, you can activate that Dreamscape Artist and then use those 2 basics that you've just generated to then play another spell. Generous Plunderer is great at color fixing. 2 mana for a 2/2 menace. At the beginning of your upkeep, you may create a treasure token. When you do, target opponent creates a tapped treasure token, but importantly, whenever it attacks, it deals damage to defending player equal to the number of artifacts they control. So I really like the fact that this incidentally hates on artifact decks while also color fixing us. It does give our opponents a tapped treasure, but I do like just a smidge of these sort of gift effects in Commander, because you can use it politically to say, hey, mana screwed player, I'll give you this treasure token, but you can't attack me for 2 or 3 turns. You can really wring some concessions out of players by giving them that mana advantage. And the treasure is tapped, so they can't use it to play like a counterspell or something on their turn. Grand Arbiter Augustine, what are you doing here? This isn't a stacks deck. Well, it is a great ramp piece, admittedly, and this guy needs a little bit of introduction because, okay, he gives our white and blue spells cost 1 less to cast, and it says spells your opponent's cast cost 1 more to cast. Okay, people freak out when they see a Grand Arbiter Augustine IV at the table, and the way that you introduce this guy is you say, table, this sucks. I'm going to play this card. I know it's really salty, but I tell you what, I just need him to stick around long enough to help me cast my commander. So give me a turn with him. And then after that, I will voluntarily attack this fella into, whatever creature that can block it to kill him. So you need to, you want to take advantage of this in the early game and allow him to survive. Because he's here to help cast your commander. Now, in the late game, you don't need to do that concession. You can just say, I'm going to plop down a Grand Arbiter Augustine IV, and, I've got this massive board state, and good luck trying to kill me, right? But in the early game, if you are using him to help cast your commander by reducing that colorless mana cost, you just have to tell your opponents, like, look, I will voluntarily, quote unquote, sacrifice this creature. I just need to use it to help ramp up my commander, and after that, your spells will go back to costing normal. So the Grand Arbiter, very powerful card, but just needs a little bit of a political introduction whenever he's being cast in the early game. Otherwise, people will really hate you for it. Then we have Knight of the White Orchid, just some great catch-up ramp here. You can search out a Plains, put it onto the battlefield untapped, but this can mana fix you if you search out your Raugrin Triumph, which is the Jeskai tri-cycling land. Then we have Professional Facebreaker, which is just a generically good human. 2/3 with menace whenever one or more creatures you control do combat damage to a player, create a treasure token, and we can sack a treasure to impulse draw for the duration of our turn only. This card is generally just good in both the early game and the late game. Typically in the early game, there's usually an opponent with only 1 creature that you can sneak through this little guy as a 2/3 menace creature that you can then make a creature token. But notably, Eowyn makes 2/2 creature tokens with with trample and haste. So we already have evasion built into our tokens, and so in the late game, this guy is going to generate you 3 treasures a turn when you're able to swing out to all 3 of your opponents. And it says whenever 1 or more creatures you control deal combat damage to a player. So that will get you 3 treasure tokens per turn cycle. Relic of Legends is in here because we probably are going to be tapping Eowyn for mana. It is a 3 mana rock, but what I've noticed is that typically we don't want to be swinging out with our Eowyns because we just like to keep them safe and tucked behind our own battlefield, and so we can tap them for mana in order to just generate some additional value out of them, and we are making a lot of legendaries via our clone strategy, so Relic of Legends actually will produce a lot more than just 1 mana. I think that, the turn this comes down, if it's in the late game, this can easily generate you more mana than you spent on it, and in the early game, it's going to be just a solid 3 mana rock. Sand Scout rather is a 2-mana 2/2 human scout. When ETBs, if an opponent controls more lands than you, search your library for a desert card, put it on battlefield tapped, then shuffle. And the rest of the card doesn't really matter because it just makes Sand Warrior tokens whenever lands are put into our graveyard from anywhere. So the 2 lands in the deck are Abraded Bluffs, and we also have Eroded Canyon as another option here. A lot of folks will run Arid Archway when they run Sand Scout in their decks, but I have found in extensive testing that I'm never happy to see Arid Archway in my hand because this deck is really hungry for mana pips, and so to give up even a little bit of that color fixing is just too much in my personal opinion to be, to utilize that extra synergy with Sand Scout if it were to tutor out that desert. So we have both tapped color producing deserts for Sand Scout to seek out. Sapphire Medallion is going to help reduce our blue spells, which you can see is actually most of the deck. And then we have Savor the Moment, which is an interesting card. I think Savor the Moment can be thought of as a blue Explore in a weird way because it says take an extra turn after this one, skip the untap step of that turn. So I look at it as, look, it's an extra combat and we get to draw a card and play a land. So if you consider that essentially draw a card, play a land as being Explore, and then for only 1 more mana, we get to make a bunch of extra triggers with Eowyn Shieldmaiden, which enter with haste, by the way. So we are just going to be reaping a ton of benefits off of Savor the Moment without having to spend the 5 mana on a proper extra turn spell. Soul Ring is here to be tutored out with Trinket Mage, always just a good card in the deck. Surveyor Scope, we are running a catch-up ramp package, and so Surveyor Scope is pretty awesome. We can pay to tap this to exile it, search your library for up to X basic land cards, where X is the number of players who control at least 2 more lands than you. Put those cards onto the battlefield untapped, I might add, then shuffle your library. So I am a big believer in Surveyor Scope. I think Richard from MTG Goldfish really proved in their gameplay videos that this card does do a ton of work, especially if you're in a catch-up ramp style of deck. I think that often there's a green player at the table who's going to be powering out way ahead on lands than the other table. So this is at minimum a rampant growth where the, more of like a 3 visits actually, because the land enters untapped. And then we can possibly even wait to play our land if we don't want, or if we want to get another basic off of exiling the Surveyor's Scope. You're taking a huge risk, I might add, but I have seen gameplay patterns before where you actually just purposely don't play a land on like turn 3, and then you were able to get that land out anyway via their Severe Scope, and now the extra land in your hand can be considered a quote-unquote card draw if, there's some mental gymnastics there. But that is to say we are running catch-up ramp, so therefore Surveyor Scope is absolutely excellent. Weathered Wayfarer is going to help us search out any land cards and put them into our hand. And again, with the catch-up ramp package, we can activate this pretty consistently. And then finally, we have War of Invention, which is pretty flexible, but I do have it in the ramp slot here because it can technically tutor out Razor Tide Bridge, which is an artifact land, so technically this could be a 3 mana ramp spell, but most of the time I think this is going to tutor you out your Banner of Kinship, for example, in order to generate an overrun effect for 8 mana, but just note that you can use this for multiple ramp options, even Soul Ring if you haven't played that on the battlefield yet, probably would tutor that out before your Razor Tide Bridge, but I think War of Invention is just so flexible and just a great tutor effect. And next we'll move to phase 2 of the game. So what do we want to be doing once we have Eowyn out, we've ramped, we're at 5 or 6 mana, now what? Well, we're going to start copying Eowyn a lot. So Auton Soldier, 6 mana 0/0, you may have it enter the battlefield as a copy of any creature on the battlefield except it isn't legendary, it's an artifact, and it has Myriad. Unfortunately, we don't get the value off of the Myriad, creating more Eowyn triggers, but notably what makes this card actually really cool is that it has 0/0 for power and toughness, meaning that we can actually grab it with tutor effects like Imperial Recruiter and Recruiter of the Guard. So this will definitely be a prime tutor target. Irenicus's Vile Duplication will do the exact same thing, a copy of target creature we control, except it has flying and isn't legendary. Nanogene Conversion I already talked about just briefly, but essentially once we have Eowyn out on the field, we've already got a bunch of humans off of Eowyn's previous triggers, and now we make all of our creatures into Eowyn. We move to combat, and then we draw like 10 cards, make 20 tokens. It's absolutely fantastic. I absolutely love seeing Nanogene Conversion in my hand. Quantum Misalignment, another Doctor Who card here. 5 mana sorcery, create a token that's a copy of target creature you control, except it isn't legendary, and it has Rebound, so we can cast it on our next turn for free on our upkeep, which is pretty amazing. And this curves really nicely into Eowyn. Cast Eowyn for 5, then you play your Quantum Misalignment. Maybe we don't have a land at that point, so if we have 5 mana to cast Eowyn, we definitely have 5 mana for the Quantum Misalignment. Then we have Roaming Throne, doubling up on all of the triggers for our humans, which is pretty fantastic. And it's going to importantly double the Eowyn triggers. So again, we're just trying to maximize the number of Eowyn triggers as we possibly can in this deck. Sakashima of 1,000 Faces, another non-legendary clone, but notably it removes the legend rule, and it can be tutored up via, I believe, Recruiter of the Guard is the one that cares about toughness because it is a 3/1. It's also a human itself, which is pretty nice. Sakashima the Imposter, another human that is a clone effect, but we can pay 4 to bounce it back to our hand at any time, or I'm sorry, at the end of turn. And then Spark Double is going to be another clone that will enter with a 1/1 counter on it. So that takes us to phase 3. So now we have a couple of clones of Eowyn on the battlefield. How do we actually capitalize on our board of 5 to 10 creatures? Well, we're running the typical overrun effects such as Akroma's Will. I really like the flexibility of Akroma's Will. When I was looking at the overrun options for this particular deck, what this deck really wants to do, because it already has the evasion baked into the tokens, having being 2/2s with trample and haste, it really wants power buffs. And so Akroma's Will is the one exception to the rest of this list, which is focused on buffing power, because it is also board wipe protection if we don't have any of our defensive counter spells in our hand. And so it gives all of our creatures protection and indestructible if we need that, which is pretty awesome. But I think most of the time this is going to be just an offensive overrun effect. And I do like the fact that it gives you lifelink, so it protects against the crackback with your creatures getting vigilance as well. Banner of Kinship we've already talked about. Creatures you control the Chosen Tide get +1/+1 counter for each fellowship counter on this artifact, and it enters with a fellowship counter on it for each creature you control, basically each human we control. Baragon of the Guard is our best human-based overrun. Whenever it or another human ETB is under our control, creatures you control get +1/+1 and gain vigilance until end of turn. Now, if we go back to our game plan here, imagine for a moment that we have 3 Eowyns on the battlefield, which is what we're trying to do. Then we play our Baragon of the Guard. Okay, so we move to combat. We get 3 Eowyn triggers, meaning that 6 tokens will enter the battlefield at the beginning of combat. So now all of our creatures, including the tokens that just entered, get +6/+6 and gain vigilance. absolutely insane. Absolutely insane. Love Beargon of the Guard. I'm super happy to see this in the late game. Caither's Crusade is going to be just one of the best ways to generate power on board within white. Some people hate tracking this card. I've never had a problem with it. You just have to bring a lot of dice. Dollmaker's Shop and Porcelain Gallery. So Porcelain Gallery is really what we're playing this for. You never want to just run out Dollmaker's Shop in a Porcelain Gallery, be ready to be activated. You always want to sandbag this in your hand and play it for only the Porcelain Gallery, because creatures you control have base power and toughness each equal to the number of creatures you control. Once again, our tokens have trample and haste, so we don't need the evasion. We just need a big power boost to push through a bunch of damage. Erkenbrand is unfortunately the worst form of the human-based overrun effects because it has the same text as Beargon of the Guard, but our creatures only get +1/+0, and they do not gain the vigilance until end of turn. But it's another effect that is a human, and I might actually swap this out for a different overrun effect, perhaps like Elish Norn or something like that. I'm still experimenting with this guy because he doesn't give that +1/+1, and I don't know. I don't like the idea of sacking all of my tokens just because Erkenbrand doesn't buff the toughness, so that kind of sucks. But nonetheless, he still does give that giant power boost because of the reasons why I just outlined with Beargon of the Guard, because if we get 6 tokens entering, that's +6/+6 immediately on the turn that this guy comes down, and so it's just pretty amazing in that way. Gold Knight Commander, same effect. Creatures we control get +1/+1, but they don't get the vigilance off of Beargon of the Guard. And then finally, we have Greymond, Avacyn Stalwart. So we get to choose 2 abilities from among First Strike, Vigilance, and Lifelink. So typically, I think we probably want to choose Vigilance and Lifelink would be my assumption. And then humans we control will have each of those chosen abilities. And as long as we control 4 more humans we control get +2/+2. So I cannot understate the importance of life gain in a deck like this, where we're looking to swing out and we want enough life to survive the crackback from our opponents. All right, and then finally, we'll move on to some of the ancillary categories here. So our card draw package is going to be a little bit across the board in terms of the style of card draw that we're aiming for. So Chart a Course, for example, has a very low ceiling, but a very high floor, where it's basically just going to be a 2-mana draw 2 every single time, which I really appreciate. This will help just bail you out of not hitting your land drops. And so a certain number of my card draw slots I like to devote to fixing your early game land drops, essentially. So Chart a Course is going to fulfill that role, and it can be searched out via our Spellseeker tutor, because this allows us to tutor out an instant sorcery with mana value 2 or less. Then we have Esper Sentinel, or as I like to call him, Espi Senti. Whenever an opponent casts the first 9 creature spell each turn, draw a card unless that player pays X, where X is its power. And this fulfills so many checkboxes for what we're looking for. It's a human, it's an artifact, and it only costs 1 or less, and its power and toughness is 1 or less. So Whir of Invention will search this guy out. Both our Imperial Recruiter and Recruiter of the Guard will search this guy out. Our Trinket Mage will search this guy out, really, and also our, which we'll talk about in just a second, Ranger of Eos and Ranger Captain of Eos can search this guy out as well. So high chance you'll see an Espi Senti during your game with this particular deck build. Expressive Iteration, much like Chart a Course, is going to be a 2-mana, basically draw 2 effect. It says, look at the top 3 cards of your library, put 1 of them into your hand, 1 of them on the bottom of your library, and exile 1 of them. You may play the exiled card this turn. So theoretically, you haven't played your land drop, you play Expressive Iteration, you play the exiled land, and now you've drawn a card, and basically drawn 1 and ramped for 2 mana. So that's best case scenario. That's what I would be aiming for with Expressive Iteration. Keep Watch is a great card in this deck. I love Keep Watch. I'm so high on this card, and I cannot believe it is only a common. What you do is you hold this up for, obviously your own combats are going to be great to cast this for, so draw a card for each attacking creature. We're going to be attacking with a lot of creatures, so we are the best opportunity to proc this effect for a lot of value. But what you can do is, even if you are behind on board for whatever reason, just hold this up up and wait for your opponents to attack other opponents, I guarantee you'll be drawing more than 3 cards off of Keep Watch. It's just great. It's just a great commander card. And Keep Watch is actually better. So for example, there's a card called Mass Appeal, which says draw a card for each human you control as a sorcery. I'd much rather run Keep Watch over Mass Appeal because Mass Appeal is dependent on you having a board, and because board wipes are the one weakness for this deck, then we actually want to be able to cast this on our opponents swinging out in case they cast a one-sided board wipe in order to get that value either way. Then we move on to just a classic tribal staple, Kindred Discovery. As it enters, choose a creature type. And we'll choose humans, obviously. Whenever a creature controls the chosen type ETBs or attacks, draw a card. So this will theoretically draw you more than 5 cards the turn it comes down, because we probably have, at least 6 or 7 humans on board ready to attack. Then we have Mangara the Diplomat, which is a 4-mana 2/4 human cleric. This is going to be a human-based form of card draw. It has lifelink. Whenever opponent attacks with creatures, if 2 or more of those creatures are attacking you, draw a card. Whenever opponent casts their second spell each turn, draw a card. So it's going to be that last clause that will probably draw us the most amount of cards. But I do like the fact that if you are the arch enemy at the table, Mangara will draw you more cards when you are attacked. And honestly, what really sets this card above the rest for me is that it does have a lifelink. If you guys have followed my deck techs in the past, I really like incidental life gain in your deck. It just feels great to be able to survive a little bit more than your opponents if somebody has a burn deck at the table, if somebody is running aristocrats pingy type of effects. I found that to have lifelink can probably earn you about an extra turn by the time the rest of your opponents are dying. So once you're able to buff this up with things like Porcelain Gallery, then all of a sudden you're going to have a 10, like a 10-10 lifelinker or something like that. So I really like just the incidental life gain stapled onto Mangara. Then we have Paul Jamar Illusionist, 6-mana 4/5 human illusion wizard. It has flying, and whenever it enters, we're going to choose humans, draw a card for each creature you control of that type. Now, I just said that Mass Appeal, I didn't like the fact how it relies on you having a board, and I guess the same could be said about Paul Jamar, but the key thing with Paul Jamar is that it comes with a 4/5 flying body, so some nice defense against flyers, which the deck is sorely lacking, and it counts itself in that trigger. So at the very least, this will cantrip. Now, if you are cantripping a 4/5 flyer for 6 mana, that's not amazing. However, once again, with the amount of free interaction that we're able to hold up with Eowyn, I really do think that the ability to build a board is so much more consistent in this deck, and so I think that Paul Jamar is going to draw you at least 3 to 4, maybe even up to 10 cards. But it does fall into that problem of it relies on the number of creatures you have on board. Ranger of Eos can search us up 2 creature cards with CMC 1 or less and put them into our hand for 4 mana. Now, if we look at what Ranger of Eos can actually find, for our options here, we have Esper Sentinel, like we already mentioned, Weathered Wayfarer to help us search up some lands. And then we have both of the Soul Sisters for that incidental life gain. And also, I'll say really quick too that I do like having these Soul Sisters in this deck. While they don't necessarily synergize with life gain, they are cheap human bodies that can help trigger Eowyn if we happen to not have a clone effect in our hand. So this can easily search us up all of either card draw, ramp, or life gain, all of things that are crucial for this particular deck. Ranger Captain of Eos will do the same thing, but it will only search up one of those creatures, and if we sacrifice it, your opponents can cast non-creature spells this turn. So if we know a particular opponent has a board wipe, we can sack it on their upkeep in order to prevent that from happening. Titan of Lityara is going to be a 6-mana 6/6. It's going to ETB choose humans. It is a human in addition to its other types. And whenever ETBs are attacked, you may draw a card for each of the creature you control that shares a creature type with it. If you do, discard a card. So not nearly as good as Paul Jamar Illusionist, because we have to discard a card and it only counts other creatures you control with that creature type. But I do really like the ceiling on this card, and this leads to just those big flashy plays that I really like. And it does does the same thing but on attack. So if this guy sticks around, you're going to be drawing just an absolute ton of cards. And then finally, because we're in white, we are running Trouble in Pairs, which I would much rather run over Ristic Study so that you don't have to constantly ask people if they pay the 1. Instead, with Trouble in Pairs, it just does it. So you don't need to ask, and it also hates on extra turns, which I do appreciate. All right, and then we'll move to our removal category here. So Clever Concealment, I am treating as a 0 mana defensive spell. We are pretty much always going to want to convoke this guy out. Any number of target non-land permanents you control phase out. And I will mention as well, so Eowyn's tokens that she generates are red, so you can't tap your red Human Knight creature tokens. However, there are enough white creatures in the deck, including Eowyn herself. And again, like I mentioned, we probably aren't going to be sending our Eowyn or Eowyn copies into combat, so they're always available as untapped to tap to convoke a Clever Concealment to protect our board and then phase those out. Fierce Guardianship, so let me actually opine on our removal slot a little bit. So when I was building this deck, I really wanted to focus on free interaction because often what happens is you play Eowyn on turn 5 and you really need her to not be removed on that turn. So if you want to, what you could do if you really dislike free counterspells, I know some people are against that in their deck building, which is totally fine. I totally get that. Also, this card is expensive. I'll mention that too. But Fierce Guardianship, you could easily replace with something like an Offer You Can't Refuse or any 1 mana counterspell that shuts off non-creature spells. But the trade-off is that now you need mana ramp that will generate you 6 mana on your turn, so that once you play Eowyn for 5 mana, you still have the 1 mana left up to hold up that counterspell. So I figured, you know what, let's just bite the bullet. We're going to put in the free interaction instead of having to build in, certain cards like Thran Dynamo, which will get you there. Other 4 mana rocks that will generate you 2 mana. I just didn't want those being a target on the battlefield. I'd really rather have my ramp me into more lands instead of mana rocks. And so that's why we're running a lot of free interaction. So Fierce Guardianship is going to be a perfect interaction piece to hold up with Eowyn on the board. Kitesail Larcenist is a human and he turns up to 3 other target artifacts or creatures into treasures that our opponents control. So this is going to just be a great sort of 3-for-1 effect, and it has Ward 1. So it makes it kind of a pain to get rid of this guy, and I do like the fact that he can take out artifacts as well, but just building all of that human synergy within human creature bodies within our removal package. Similar thing with Lorn of the Third Path, 3 mana 2/1 Vigilance. When ETBs destroy up to 1 target artifact or enchantment, and then she comes along with a very nice card draw ability. Once again, you can use this a little politically to curry some favor. Mana Drain is going to be a piece of interaction that is just so good that we can't not put it in the deck. Once again, I know people absolutely hate Mana Drain. It was definitely not designed for Commander. It was designed back when Mana Burn was a thing, and that's why it's super expensive. But this card will actually just win you games if you're able to counter a big enough spell. That little bit of mana on your following turn has won me games in the past. It just wins games, frankly. So that's why it is in the deck. We're also running a Pact of Negation, which is another free counter spell. So this is going to be for 0 mana. We can counter target spell, and then we have to pay 5 on our next upkeep. And once again, this is going to prevent a board wipe, and so we are happy to pay 5 mana at the beginning of our next upkeep to basically keep our board around in order to close out the game. I've come around on Pact of Negation, to be quite honest. This is another Richard from MTG Goldfish pick where the logic is like, okay, well, I wouldn't use the counterspell if it wasn't game ending. So therefore, I am going to use the counterspell on the game ending spells, and who cares if I have to pay the mana later, because we're going to stop that game winning spell, or rather a spell that would make me lose on our opponent's turn. So that's why Pact of Negation is in the deck. We're running a Swan Song, just an efficient counter target enchantment, instant, or sorcery spell to turn off those board wipes once again. And we are running Teferi's Protection. This is another sort of white staple. It's both a fog, it protects your board, it does everything. The other card I might consider, although it is very expensive, would be like a Perch Protection. But at that point, I'd rather just maybe run an extra turn spell like Time Warp instead of Perch Protection, but I'll talk about extra turn spells in just a second. We are running 3 board wipes, so Cyclonic Rift, mostly because it can be grabbed from Spellseeker. I actually don't run Cyclonic Rift in a lot of my decks, but with Spellseeker, Cyclonic Rift is like basically just the spell you want to tutor for almost all of the time, unless you're really starving on card draw and hitting your land drops, in which case we would maybe tutor out like a Chart a Course or Expressive Iteration here. But Cyclonic Rift is, I don't know, a little bit too stapley for my typical deck building tastes, but it's so good. I mean, you know, nobody's going to fault me, I think, for having this in the deck. Raise the Palisade is going to be a one-sided board wipe most of the time, although I will say that Raise the Palisade in a human tribal deck, not as powerful because a lot of creatures are just incidentally human, so just be aware that your mileage may vary with Raise the Palisade. And then finally, what I like to actually play as a quote-unquote board wipe is Taunt from the Rampart. For 5 mana, goad all creatures your opponents control until your next turn. Those creatures can't block. So this card, in effect, leads to a lot of damage being thrown around the table, and it turns off blockers. So it ultimately means you can swing and be totally unblocked, and your opponents have to do the exact same thing on their turn. Taunt from the Rampart, absolutely amazing. One of my favorite commander cards ever. If I'm in a Boros deck, I simply play Taunt from the Rampart. And then one other comment, I guess, going back to Raise the Palisade for just a moment. If you wanted to run, you could run Disrupt Decorum if you wanted more goad, or a quicker way to close out the game. Disrupt Decorum can help goad your opponent's creatures, but it does not have the added benefit from Taunt from the Rampart, which is that those creatures can't block. You know, your mileage may vary once again within either Disrupt Decorum or Raise the Palisade. We've already talked about these briefly, but for tutors, we're running Imperial Recruiter, 3 mana 1/1, ETB, search library for a creature with power 2 or less, reveal it, put it in your hand, then shuffle. Recruiter of the Guard, same thing, but for toughness. Spellseeker will tutor us out an instant or sorcery card mana by 2 or less. And then Trinket Mage will grab us an artifact card with CMC 1 or less, reveal it, and put it into our hand. And if we look at what we can grab with each of these respective cards here, just because I already mentioned Trinket Mage, so it can grab our Soul Ring, I can grab a land, or it can draw our Esper Sentinel. And if you look at Imperial Recruiter and Recruiter of the Guard, there's several different cards we can tutor out. So we've got a bunch of ramp options. We can tutor out our Spark Double or Auton Soldier, probably Spark Double a lot of the time because it's a little bit cheaper than the Auton Soldier. Gold Knight Commander can be searched up with Imperial Recruiter, which is pretty great. We could get out Removal with Kitesail Larcenist or Lauren. And there's a bunch of draw options, life gain, or just other tutors if we really want to do that. Although if you're searching up a Spellseeker with your Imperial Recruiter, you're probably not playing the deck correctly. I'll just say that. But all right, and then that takes us to, I believe we have just the Soul Sisters. Like I already mentioned, we are running both Soul Warden and Soul's Attendant. And then finally, I just want to go over our mana base really quick. So this mana base is optimized for pip generation and a little bit of utility lands. So we've got our Desert here, which can be searched out via Sand Scout. Ancient Ziggurat, we are running a total of, I believe, 32 creatures. So Ancient Ziggurat, mostly they're to color fix us for Eowyn again, but we are running 32 creatures, so that should be enough to power out a lot of our spells. Arid Mesa for fetching. We are running a catch-up ramp package, so we're running all 3 of the bounce lands, Azorius Chancery, Boros Garrison, and Is It Boilerworks, which will draw us a card. And then Cavern of Souls is going to make our human creatures uncounterable. City of Brass is going to add 1 mana of any color, but it deals damage to us. The rest of these are going to be very much just color fixing lands. Exotic Orchard for any color. Fabled Passage can search us out a basic of any color. Flooded Strand, same thing. We've got the Shock lands. We've got Horizon of Progress as an extra bit of ramp if we need it. That second ability, we can pay 3, tap it to put a land card from our hand on the battlefield tapped. Lorien Revealed is in a land slot because we can pay 1 to search up an island, which can grab any island, by the way, so this can grab our Raugrin Triumph. Otawara for bouncing things, Path of Ancestry for a bunch of scry triggers. Plaza of Heroes is here because we really just need to generate the pips to cast Eowyn, and then because this deck aims to get a bunch of legendaries on the field, we can often just cast it for Jeskai, tap it for Jeskai colors. Prismatic Vista can search out basics. Rogran Triumph for the color fixing. Razortide Bridge can be searched out with our various artifact tutors. We've got more pip fixing, and then our Soporific Springs is actually a Sink into Stupor on the spell side, which is 3 mana, return target spell or non-permanent and opponent controls to its owner's hand, which is just one of the best MDFCs from Modern Horizons 3 in my personal opinion. And then 3 Tree City, of course, for our tribal decks. This will generate so much mana for us. This thing is absolutely insane, so overpowered in a tribal deck. Volcanic Fissure is Sundering Eruption on the spell side. For 3 mana, destroy target land. As control may search library for a basic land, put it on the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle. And importantly, creatures without flying can't block this turn. Why they put this on a card, I have no idea. The fact that this is on the backside of a land is just absolutely insane to me. You can you can cast this for 3 mana and just swing out without a care in the world for what blockers your opponents have. Absolutely amazing. And then Witch Blast Meadow is a human on the front side, which ETBs and destroys target artifact or enchantment and opponent controls for 4 mana. So a little bit inefficient, but it's a human and it is pretty great. So let's finally talk about some notable exclusions, and then we'll talk about some budget swaps here. So finally, if we scroll down here to our notable exclusions, you will see Herald's Horn is a card I like to include in many decks, but I found that because this deck wanted to run so many clone effects, you really need about 40 creatures of the given type in order to make Herald's Horn like really good. I just found that this wasn't drawing me a card that often, and so Herald's Horn was swapped out for, I think, Cursed Mirror, I want to say, and it just didn't draw enough cards to be worth it, and I felt like I was bending the deck unnecessarily around this card, so we just cut it. Deflecting SWAT is not included, although it is free interaction, because we want to protect against board wipes as much as possible. Really, once we get more than one Eowyn on the field, targeted removal is no longer an issue, because we are going, as long as we have one Eowyn on the battlefield that we can keep copying, who cares, right? Who cares? We need a board wipe in order to stop us. So deflecting SWAT is not the type of defense that we're looking for. Really, we want to just be defending against board wipes as much as possible. The 101st and 102nd cards in the deck would definitely be Ascend from Avernus. This is just going to be a mass reanimate effect that I absolutely love and is super good. Angel of Glory's Rise is the same thing, but it's less flexible than Ascend from Avernus, because Ascend from Avernus you can actually cast for 5 or 6 depending on what you need, whereas Angel of Glory's Rise is always going to be 7 mana. And you know, I could still see possibly putting these into the deck as a late game option, but what I found is that once so let's say we are board wiped, right? All of our copies of Eowyn go to the graveyard. Well, before it was really a lot of sorceries that created copies of Eowyn. So like if we go up to here, like our Renicus's Vial Duplication, Nanogene Conversion, Quantum Misalignment, I guess the rest of these are creatures, but I don't know. It just seemed like the Ascend from Avernus seemed to be rotting in my hand a lot of the time, because you have to assume that you are board wiped at some point in order for this card to be good, because we are not naturally self-milling. So I just felt like this was too niche to, like, when it is cast, it is amazing. There's no question about that. It's just the percent of the time that this is good to be cast is so niche, because we have to assume that we had a destroy board wipe come down, and even the, you know, your farewells will make this card less good, which are pretty popular in Commander nowadays. So these were just cut, although they are really the 101st and 102nd cards in the deck, truly. Then I want to talk about extra combat effects briefly. So we recently got the cheapest extra combat effect in the form of Great Train Heist from Outlaws of Thunder Junction, and this was in the deck initially, but what I had found is that if we are running an extra combat effect, which typically costs about 5 mana on average, if we just ignore Great Train Heist for a moment, I'd rather just run an extra turn spell. Like, why would you only get an extra combat instead of just taking a whole extra turn? And people don't like extra turn spells. So it just seemed like extra combat effects were just not as good as the, power boosting overrun effects that we wanted to do. Now, I will say there's amazing synergy with extra combats and, time warps and things like that, because really, again, what this deck wants to be doing is maximizing the number of Eowyn triggers, and this does that very well. However, there becomes a mathematical problem at some point where, while we technically might be able to generate, let's say, 10 additional 2/2s with trample and haste by taking extra combat, that's less power generation than we could possibly get by playing a different card like Caither's Crusade, for example, which when, 5 2/2s enter, then now all of a sudden our creatures are being boosted by +5/+5. And so you do the math, and it turns out that once we are generating the amount of tokens that we are, 10 to 20 a turn, then extra combat effects just become mathematically inferior to power and toughness boosting cards like Porcelain Gallery, for example. So that's just some notes on Great Train Heist. And then once again, Time Warp, extra turn effects are not being run just because they're extra turn effects, although you could really put these into most blue decks and be perfectly fine, but people just don't like them. And then finally, Breath of Fury is not included in this deck. This is a 2-card infinite combo with Eowyn. Essentially, you put this on one of the tokens that Eowyn generates. Whenever a enchanted creature deals combat damage to a player, sacrifice it and attach Breath of Fury to a creature you control. If you do on top of all creatures you control, and after this phase there's an additional combat phase, and Eowyn makes more tokens, so then this goes on to another creature, you make another combat, Eowyn makes more tokens, goes on to another creature, so on and so forth. So I just don't like infinite combos, so this isn't in the deck. And then finally, I guess we will touch on some budget options, but I actually have to make that section of the video. I don't actually have that off the top of my head, so that will be the sort of final section of this video. So Editor Nathan, you can put those budget swaps in now. All right, and that is the video, guys. Thank you all for watching. Once again, I will make a goldfishing playtest video where you can see how this deck performs. Once again, we assemble a lethal board state by turn 7. So if you want to see that, click on the link in the description below, and hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you did, leave a like on it and subscribe to see more awesome Commander deck techs from me. Once again, my name is Nathan. You've been watching Solid Productions, and hopefully we'll see you all in the next one.